So
I look wider than I actually am.
He did it on purpose to make us feel self-conscious.
Right,
Hey,
so that's not what it's going to look like.
Width that concerns me.
I think we are good to go.
It's okay. I know I have a fat soul.
Alrighty, what is up, everybody? Welcome back to the Unfolding Revelation podcast. This is episode 2 of the podcast. If this is your first time tuning in, my name is Nick Griffin. I am the lead pastor at Wayfarers Christian Church. And today for this podcast, I am joined by a professor here at Mid-South Christian College and Revelation superfan, Greg Waddell. And also a guy we found on the side of the street,
Again.
Zach House.
I heard y'all had smoothies, so I came in.
If this is, like I said, your first time tuning in, I would encourage you, check out the last episode we did. These first 3 episodes of this podcast are going to be, first 4 episodes of this podcast are going to be an introduction to the book of Revelation. We think it's really important to have a good basis, a good foundation for exactly what it is that we're going to talk about before we start diving in immediately into the verses. Sometimes I think we get a little too ahead of ourselves and start jumping into the verses immediately. And so we want to make sure that we're laying a good foundation, really understanding what this book means. So in the last episode, we talked a little bit about what was some of the purpose behind the writing of the book and what was some of the purposes that John had with the book. And today we're going to be talking about a couple different things related to it. But first off, we're starting with a really key and important part to this book, which is its heavy revelation with the Old Testament. Why don't you explain a little bit of that for us, Greg?
Yeah, it's fascinating when you start to think about it. 278 verses in the book of Revelation contain direct quotations from the Old Testament.
Wow.
And what's interesting is by comparison, there are only 200 allusions, not even
direct quotations.
Combination of allusions and quotations to the Old Testament in all of the Apostle Paul's epistles.
Wow.
And he quotes the Bible, the Old Testament, quite often. So this is like it's almost like an anthology of the Old Testament,
It
the book
really
of
is.
Revelation. It's
Yeah.
amazing.
I have never heard that stat before. That is wild. So there's 200 quotations and allusions in all of the Apostle Paul, and in just the book of Revelation, you get 278 direct quotations.
And 500 allusions.
And
to the Old
500
Testament.
allusions. So this book especially has a very deep and heavy connection with the Old Testament. Zach, I know that whenever we talked originally about wanting to start this series, this was something that kind of inspired you, a connection you noticed on your own, which I think is really impressive. It's cool that you picked that up. How did you do that? What was kind of the situation that led you to figuring this out?
Oh man. So I guess it was like the start of the pandemic project, Like,
Yeah.
oh no, the world's ending. Better catch up.
So, start of the pandemic, what'd you start doing?
So I kind of realized I had never read it for myself, the Revelation at least. And I decided, I need to make up my own mind about this. So I read it, and then I copied it chapter for chapter, word for word. And then at the end of it, I was like, I still have questions. So I do a lot of walking. And so my loop at the time, this road loop, I know it was like 7 miles long.
Yeah.
So it's 2 miles I would walk, or 2 hours I would walk with my mom, just talking about what I read, what was going through my head out loud with her and talking about it, seeing if it makes sense. And shortly after I finished that, because it didn't take long.
I don't know. It sounds like a long time to me, but yeah. Shortly after that,
a group of us got together and started going through the Bible chronologically.
Mm-hmm.
And then, like, from the get-go, I just noticed stuff that was in the Old Testament that was, like, clearly in Revelation. I was like, what is all this stuff doing here, and what do I do with it?
That's awesome. So you were doing this study, or you had copied the book itself, and we're really looking at it, and so it was fresh on your mind. Then you start chronologically going to the Old Testament, and you're just like, wow, I've seen this before.
Right.
And so you saw that connection, and it's a very thorough connection, as we pointed out. Greg, you have a couple of example for us, right?
Yeah.
Show us a few of these
Sure.
examples.
And-
Not all 278. I don't think we have time for
Okay,
that.
I'll try to hold it down. But I wanted to say that what's interesting that today we understand the concept of hyperlinks because of the way we use computers. So we always click one thing, it'll take you to another page and find something there, and you can click that, and it'll take you to something else, a completely different site. I think that these when the New Testament apostles quoted from the Old Testament, these were like hyperlinks. They were saying, go look it up
Yeah.
and read the whole content, read the
Yeah.
whole story.
So you would see this one little verse that referenced something in the Old Testament, and you were supposed to click that link,
Click that link.
have it take you to the whole passage,
This
and go
is
read the whole thing.
hyperlinks 3,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago.
Biblical hyperlinks.
Biblical hyperlinks.
And I think that's important. That's something that we're going to try to do as we go through this series. We're going to try to click those hyperlinks and not just point them out. But show us a few
Here's
of
a
them.
couple.
Yeah.
Revelation 1:5, for example, says, "From Jesus Christ, the faithful witness, the firstborn of the dead, and the ruler of the kings of the earth, to him who loves us and freed us from our sins by his blood." Psalm 89:27 says, "I will make him the firstborn, the highest of the kings of the earth." Very clearly,
Yeah.
similar language. Revelation 1:15, "His feet are like burnished bronze, refined in the furnace, and his voice was like the roar of many waters." Probably like the roar of many lions as well, but in this case, it's the roar of many waters. And that's a reflection of Ezekiel 1:24. "And when they went, I heard the sound of their wings, like the sound of many waters, like the sound of the Almighty, the sound of the tumult, and like the sound of an army." This one's an interesting one, and I want to point out something real quick. That we know that John saw something. I mean, this was a vision he had, right? So he actually saw something. But we also know that what he saw has direct links to the Old Testament
Yeah.
texts. It's a textual, literary connection.
Yeah.
So where's the genius in making these literary connections? I would say if John saw this, John's not the genius here, it's Jesus.
Yeah.
He's
Yeah.
showing him things that are direct links to Old Testament texts.
Yeah.
Fascinating, huh?
Yeah, it's. I think we read these. I know, especially when we read through the book, sometimes we get this feeling like, man, this is wild stuff. Where is this coming from? I have no idea where this is coming from. But John, as a faithful Jew who had grown up on these scriptures, he would have been that and like, I know that reference. I've seen that one before. I know what that means.
Yeah. Here's another one. Revelation 1:16. "In his right hand he held 7 stars, and from his mouth came a sharp two-edged sword, and his face was like the sun shining in its full strength." Isaiah 49:2. Wonderful chapter. That chapter is fascinating. "He made my mouth like a sharp sword, and in the shadow of his hand he hid me." Again, just another reference, and this is just a small sampling of what we have.
Yeah. And so John, as somebody who was raised on the scriptures, who knew what these references were, Jesus is showing him things in this vision that he can make those connections.
Yep.
And, we can say that the purpose is not just for John to make those connections, but for us to do that as well. So especially as we go forward in this book, I think that's going to be something that's really important to us, is to continue to make those connections. So I've been mentioning here this guy by the name of John over and over and over again. I think one of the things we got to really establish if we're looking at the foundation of this book is who is John? Who is this guy? Do we know him? Have we ever seen him before? Who is John specifically? So what is some of the evidence we can find about helping us show who John is?
Well, I think first of all, it's interesting to note that John identifies himself as one of the prophets, which is interesting. And this is in Revelation 1:3. Blessed is the one who reads aloud the words of this prophecy, and blessed are those who hear and who keep what is written in it, for the time is near. He's identifying himself as a prophet, right along with the Old Testament prophets.
So John, if we're trying to paint the picture, who's this guy John?
He's a prophet.
He's a prophet. That's important to know, that is how he views himself.
Mm-hmm. And he names himself several times, Revelation 1, 4, and 5, John, up to the 7 churches that are in Asia. So he has a relationship with the Asian churches. It's important to notice.
They know who he is.
They know who he is. And it's important to note that, I'll just go ahead and spoiler here.
Oh, no.
I think it was the Apostle John. The Apostle John lived out most of his last days in Ephesus, which is one of the churches in Asia Minor.
It's interesting that we don't consider John a prophet. I can remember no one in church ever telling me, "Oh yeah, John, this disciple, that's a prophet," but he's clearly saying prophetic words.
Yeah, we start listing all the prophets. We don't list John
Right.
as one of the prophets.
Yeah, and it explains a little bit because the prophets were a lot like poets in a lot of ways. They used a lot more poetic language, metaphors, and figurative language than any other types of writing. And John does that. I think of John as the poet of the New Testament, whereas I think of the Apostle Paul as the philosopher of the New Testament.
We see John as a prophet, a poet, and he identifies himself specifically as the author of this book. He does it a couple times, several times. You said you mentioned in the book. So, what's one of the other examples?
And in Revelation 1, chapter 1, verses 1 and 2, he says that the angel, that Jesus communicated this revelation to him. He made it known to him by sending his angel to his servant John. He calls himself the servant of Jesus here. And in Revelation 1:9, he calls himself your brother and your partner. So the churches in Asia Minor know him. They see him as a brother and a partner in their ministry. So that's kind of important too. And then Revelation 22:8, I, John, the one who heard and saw these things.
So he identifies himself. We've decided he's a prophet, poetic prophet, who is known by the original recipients of this letter. They know who he is. And so that leads us to kind of one of the questions, because if you've grown up in church, I think a lot of people, they're like, why are we spending all this time talking about this? We know who John is. He's, one of Jesus's disciples. He is the guy who wrote the Gospel of John and 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John and Revelation. We know who that guy is. Why is this such a big deal? But I think it's important because I think you'd be surprised how many people you'll find out there, even within churches, who say, no, this is a different John. This is not John,
written
the apostle.
In the 2nd or 3rd century or something like that.
Right. There's all kinds of crazy thoughts out there like that. And so we want to look at some evidence for why we're going to take the position that it is the apostle, the disciple of Jesus, the same John that we grew up knowing in church. So what are some arguments that we can hear to defend that?
That's the internal evidence. And G.K. Beale, and I know it doesn't actually say, he didn't come out and say, I am the Apostle John, the one that, but G.K. Beale says something interesting. He says, it is highly unlikely that another John, originally a Palestinian Jew, as evidenced by the way he uses the Old Testament, ever lived and worked among the churches in Asia and had such a level of authority than John the Apostle. Thus, the Apostle John was probably the author of this book. Apart from that, many of the themes that we particularly associate with the Gospel of John and his letters, such as, this is just a small sampling, Jesus as the Word, the Lamb, the Shepherd, manna, the living water, light and life, conquest, word and commandments of God, and others, many others, also appear in the book of Revelation. So he concludes also, G.K. Beale has this wonderful commentary. And if you want the big scholarly one, it's like 3 inches thick. And then he has a condensed version of
All right, the Spark Notes.
Yeah, he does.
That's awesome. So that's one you recommend on the book of Revelation by G.K.
Beale. B-E-A-L-E.
And so he's taking the same position that we're going to take on this podcast, which is that, it's the Apostle John that kind of wrote this. And we've looked at some evidence in the book. He identifies himself that way. But there's also just some external evidence outside of the book itself that we can find to help us defend this position that it's John the
Yeah, when we
Apostle?
talk about external evidence, we're talking about evidence that comes not from the Bible itself, or from the book itself, but from other authors that lived close to that time. And for example, we have Justin Martyr, who lived in AD 166, thereabouts. With us, there was a certain man named John. He wrote this in his dialogue with Trypho. With us, there was a certain man named John, the one who was of the apostles of Jesus, who prophesied by a revelation that was made to him that those who believe in our Christ will live 1,000 years in Jerusalem, and in short that anyway. I'm not going to read the whole quote here, but he refers to John as the apostle, the one who wrote the book of Revelation. And that's fairly close. 166 AD, he probably wrote this.
Yeah. And so it's some early evidence, and he does specifically say John, who was one of the apostles of Christ,
Right.
who gave all these prophecies by a revelation.
Right.
But it's more than just him, right? There's
More
some
than
other
just
stuff.
him. Irenaeus, who's a little bit later, AD 190. John, also the disciple of the Lord, contemplating the priestly and glorious advent of his kingdom, says in Revelation, I turned to see the voice that spoke to me. That comes in his work called Against Heresies.
So we can clearly see very early on a lot of people who specifically believe that
That pretty
this
much,
John is not just some other guy named John, but the apostle
pretty
John.
much the universal view of the early church was that it was the Apostle John.
Did you have one more quote there?
Yeah, one more quote here from Origen. He says, why need we speak of him who leaned on Jesus' breast? John, who left behind one gospel and who also wrote to us the Apocalypse. So there you have it.
So all kinds of evidence. There's also Clement of Alexandria, Tertullian of Carthage, Hippolytus of Rome. All these very early people who are clearly telling us that it's not just some random guy named John. It is John, the disciple, the guy who leaned over onto Jesus at the Last Supper, and the one who wrote these epistles as well. Now, these dates, these references are all really early, 150 AD into the 200s, some of those kinds of stuff. Some people, this may kind of bring up another question of us, which is, this is really early, but I mean, are we talking is 150 AD, is that like 100 years later though? Is it like 50 years later?
That depends on our dating because...
So that's the question.
Yeah.
We got to figure out, we've decided John's the one who wrote it. We decided part of his thing he wants to show us is all these connections to the Old Testament. And so when did he write it? Is the next question.
Yeah.
About what time do we think that that he wrote this?
There's two theories that I would call evangelical theories, theories from people who take John the Apostle to be the author. One is the early, we call the early date, and the other the late date. The early date is sometime near or right after, or during the reign of Nero. And Nero, his reign was from 54 to 68 AD 54 to 68. The other proposal is Domitian, under the reign of Domitian, which is 81 to 96. I think it's the latter. I think it was John is writing this toward the end of the first century.
So the kind of two options a lot of people give us is the early date, sometime in the year 54 to 68.
Probably around 68, 69.
Right. For Nero as the emperor at the time. And a later date,
96.
96,
thereabouts.
saying that it would be Domitian being the emperor at the time. So what evidence do we have as to why that might be?
The evidence that I would give is again, going back to Irenaeus, who in his Against Heresies again, he said that the apocalyptic vision was seen not long ago, but almost in our day, toward the end of Domitian's reign. So he specifically specifies this toward the end of Domitian's reign. And we know when Domitian stopped reigning. It was in 96. That was the year that his reign ended. So that's pretty strong evidence. Tertullian, here we have the date, 150 to 212. We don't have Tertullian's original writing on the date of Apocalypse, but we do have Jerome, who refers not only Jerome but also Eusebius, who referred to Tertullian, and they claim that Tertullian placed the date of Apocalypse during the reign of Domitian. And we have Clement of Alexandria, who lived from 155 to 215. In his ecclesiastical history, he writes that John returned from the island Patmos after the tyrant was dead. And in his earlier part of that work, he identifies the tyrant as Domitian. So he's talking about Domitian there. And a Roman by the name of Cassius Dio, who lived from 155 to 235, he doesn't mention John, but he does refer 3 times to Domitian's practice of banishment. Apparently, this was a characteristic of Domitian's reign, in that he would exile people on islands like that, and that he also mentions that the exiles were immediately released upon Domitian's death in 96. So that would place the writing of it or at least the release of John from Patmos at a very specific date.
Yeah.
And then there's Marcus Plavonius Victorinus.
Wow.
What awesome names.
Yeah.
But he said that when John said these things, he was on the island of Patmos, condemned to work in the mines by Caesar Domitian. So he places it also in the time of Domitian's reign.
Or Domitian.
Domitian.
Right. And so it's a lot of really good evidence for why that date might be the one. Obviously, though, there are other people who hold to that earlier date. Why do you think, what types of arguments do you think people have as to why they hold to that earlier date usually? Is it archaeological evidence, or is it more...
I think there's 2 things going on there. One that you mentioned as we were talking before
Yeah.
broadcast. What was it again?
Well, there is some textual evidence. I've heard a few people argue for
the 666.
right, for why
It's hard.
Some early Christians believed that it was Nero. It is hard to explain. We'll leave it as a teaser. Whenever we get to the 666 portion,
It has something to do, with the numbering.
So there's some evidence I've heard from some people.
Yeah, and there's
that
another
way.
thing that goes on. There's a statement that Jesus makes that these things will take place before this generation is gone. And some people take that literally and take it to refer to anything to do with the second coming. And so therefore, the whole of the book of Revelation has to have occurred before that generation passed away.
And so overall, it's theological evidence. Is kind of what you
that's
said.
definitely a theological one. Yeah.
There's more theological
I
evidence.
think it's a misinterpretation of that what saying of Jesus, but.
Right. And so I have always grown up with that earlier date as the only one. I'm not sure that I'm 100% convinced to give it up just yet, but I am. I think you brought up some good
That's
evidence.
all right. You'll still go to heaven.
And so it'll be interesting kind of as we go through here. I think we'll be able to see why this matters. Why is it important to know when the book was written? I think it's because it'll help us understand a little bit about what was trying to be accomplished in this book. But I think the other and maybe the most important thing that's for us to realize when it comes to understanding this book is that it's not just it didn't just descend from heaven perfectly written in King James English, leather bound and with gold edges on the pages, but that this was also, like many other books in the Bible, a letter that was addressed to a specific group of people. So who is it addressed to? Who are the people that this book was directed at?
It's fascinating how the book introduces this because it says that Jesus held in his hands the 7 stars. And you say, what is he talking about? What 7 stars? You know, is he talking about 7 stars in Hollywood? No.
Yeah. George Clooney.
He'd be on my list of 7 stars.
Okay, all right.
But this is in 116. But later on in the book, he actually identifies these as 7 churches, the 7 churches of Asia Minor. I'm told that they were actually on a mail route.
Yeah, I've heard that too.
Yeah, kind of like the Pony Express.
You're
type of
right.
thing.
And so it would have been easy for one person carrying this revelation that John has written down as he's been in exile. They take that circuit and they could hit all these 7 churches really easily. So what are those 7 churches?
So the 7 churches are Ephesus, which is, by the way, the place where John spent his most of his life after we, he leaves Jerusalem, and Smyrna, and then Pergamon, and then Thyatira, and Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea. So those would be the 7 churches, and it's Asia Minor, basically, where Turkey, modern day Turkey, is today. Sometimes we think of Asia, we think more
Right.
Oriental. We're actually talking about modern day Turkey.
Yeah. And so it's important, as again we'll see as we go along, but it's important to understand that these are the very first people who hear this revelation, and it's for a very particular reason, I believe, that it was addressed to those churches. And kind of what was that reason?
Yeah, well, one of the things, a lot of things were going on at the time, and one of them was that they were experiencing persecution. Most of the persecution was not directly directed by Rome, but it was more the local people who feared that this movement. Sometimes it was the local people who feared that this movement was leading people to turn against the worship of Caesar, and if they turned against the worship of Caesar, which obviously Christians would, that this would bring Rome down upon them, and everybody feared that. Nobody wanted Rome to come with their armed forces.
Yeah. Trying to keep Caesar happy, and
Keep
they were
Caesar
like,
happy. Yeah.
you guys are troublemakers. Let's not do this, and let's not do this around here. So they wanted to deal with the problem before Rome had to come and do it.
Yeah. And
Just be good tributaries.
just be obedient.
Right.
And so these churches in this area of modern day Turkey, they're experiencing persecution. They're probably feeling really discouraged in a lot of ways.
So they need some encouragement, and
Yeah.
that's what I think we talked about that in our
We did.
previous podcast. That's one of the purposes, to encourage.
Well, I really like the encouragement part because I feel like we don't talk about that enough. Like, I really love how God in every little part to each church is like, I have this against you, and sometimes he doesn't have anything against them. But then he like constructive criticizes them and saying, but this is what you're good at, and here's how you overcome it.
And so he has it's not just abstractly addressed to this whole big group of people, but he's like, hey, look, I know you guys. I know you. I know what you're about.
He's talking
And
like
he's
a
talking to
father.
them specifically.
That's a really good point. Sometimes as professors, we can get into the habit of just pointing out the things that the student did wrong and forget to point out what they did right.
Yeah.
And I know personally, like if, in my photography, if I put a photo up and one of my colleagues critiques it, even if when I ask for them to critique it and they say, that part's not good, oh, that hurts.
It still kind of hurts, yeah.
And so, it's directly written by Jesus. He knows them. He gives them encouragement and some constructive criticism on some things that they need to address. But it's specifically to these 7 churches in Asia Minor. So that's an important first step we covered here.
And a conclusion we could draw from that is that they were expected to understand it.
Right.
So we can't place upon this a meaning that they would never
have understood.
Yeah.
understood. That's
Right.
important.
Yeah. So that is one part of it. Another part of it, the one that I would say I'm waiting to be convinced on, but Greg, you've given us some good evidence that it was possibly written in AD 96, maybe even probably written in AD 96, and under the specific time period of what was going on with the Emperor Domitian. We've talked about that it was written by the Apostle John, and that's the
Mm-hmm.
position we're going to take. This isn't just some other random guy named John. This is the Apostle John, and there's a lot of evidence for that, both in the text of it and outside of the text. And it's written to these 7 churches because they are suffering through persecution for their faith. And that's an important purpose all throughout. I think that's an important thing that we got to see. So, Zach, you want to end us with our tagline that we came up with last time? Do you remember what it is?
Gosh. Easy, breezy, beautiful.